By early September 1552, military operations in northern Hungary had reached a decisive point in the annual campaigning cycle. During the same year, several fortified positions across central regions had already been reduced or abandoned following sustained pressure. Ottoman forces had advanced along established routes, clearing obstacles as part of a broader, coordinated campaign. What remained in the north was a reduced defensive line, anchored by a small number of fortified sites whose continued occupation restricted movement across the region. One of these sites was the fortress at Eger. The fortress stood on elevated ground above the surrounding valleys, within reach of routes connecting central territories to northern Hungary. Its role within the defensive system was defined by location rather than size or reputation. Control of the site affected road access, communications, and the movement of troops between regions. The fortress remained occupied because withdrawal would have removed one of the last barriers limiting further advance. At this stage of the campaign, an Ottoman field army was already operating within range of the fortress. Its movement followed established patterns of 16th-century warfare. Campaigns were conducted within seasonal limits, and operations were planned around supply availability and the systematic reduction of fortified positions. Siege warfare formed the core of this approach. Fortresses controlling roads, river crossings, or junctions were isolated and reduced to secure continued movement. Inside the fortress, the garrison was limited in both number and resources. This reflected conditions along the frontier, where manpower and funding were uneven and reinforcement could not be assumed. Soldiers, hired troops, and non-combatants were present within the walls. The fortress was not maintained as an exceptional stronghold, but as one element within a wider defensive network stretched across a contested zone. At this point, the disparity between the approaching army and the defenders was widely recognized. Contemporary expectations, shaped by earlier operations during the same campaign season, favored the attackers. An army equipped with artillery and engineering support was generally understood to hold decisive advantages over an isolated garrison. In comparable situations, outcomes were usually determined by the duration of pressure rather than by any single engagement. Once bombardment began and relief failed to arrive, surrender often followed. By early September, Ottoman units began to concentrate in the area surrounding Eger. This movement was coordinated rather than improvised. Troops arrived along known routes, supported by logistical arrangements prepared earlier in the year. Artillery and specialized personnel accompanied the force, indicating preparation for a formal siege rather than a limited demonstration intended to force immediate submission. At the same time, the structure of the fortress set clear limits on what resistance could achieve. Sections of the medieval walls had been reinforced, and internal spaces had been reorganized to support defense. These measures, however, were partial. The design did not fully reflect newer fortification principles being adopted elsewhere, and the walls remained vulnerable to prolonged artillery fire. Those inside the fortress were aware that damage was likely and that external assistance could not be expected in the near term. As the Ottoman forces completed their initial deployment, standard siege procedures followed in sequence. Reconnaissance was conducted to assess terrain and firing angles. Positions were selected for artillery placement. The surrounding area was secured to prevent movement into or out of the fortress. Over several days, these actions resulted in the complete isolation of the garrison from the countryside. Within the walls, defensive preparations proceeded according to routine practice. Available provisions were inventoried. Positions along the walls were assigned. Vulnerable sections were inspected in anticipation of bombardment. These measures mirrored those taken at other frontier fortresses earlier in the year, many of which had nonetheless fallen after similar preparations. The broader context of the 1552 campaign reinforced prevailing expectations. Ottoman operations elsewhere had demonstrated the effectiveness of coordinated sieges supported by artillery and sustained supply. Fortresses with larger garrisons and more extensive defenses had been reduced after limited resistance. There was no immediate indication that this engagement would depart from established patterns. At this stage, the situation at Eger reflected a familiar structure of 16th-century warfare. An attacking army is prepared to apply systematic pressure against a fortified position. The defenders relied on existing walls, limited manpower, and the ability to adapt internal defenses as damage occurred. The outcome depended on how long these opposing capacities could be sustained under siege conditions. When the Ottoman army settled before the fortress, the operation appeared routine within the framework of the campaign. The fortress stood intact but exposed. Its defenders were confined within walls known to be vulnerable, facing an opponent equipped to reduce such positions as part of standard military practice. Before the events that reshaped Central Europe in the 16th century, the Kingdom of Hungary functioned as a frontier monarchy positioned between expanding imperial systems. Its political structure, military capacity, and territorial administration reflected long-standing conditions rather than sudden weakness. Understanding these conditions is necessary to explain why later defensive systems, including the fortress at Eger, operated under persistent strain. By the late 15th and early 16th centuries, Hungary occupied a broad geographic zone stretching from the Carpathian Mountains to the southern plains along the Danube and its tributaries. This territory placed the kingdom directly along routes used for trade, migration, and military movement between the Balkans and Central Europe. As a result, Hungary's security depended less on deep internal defenses than on the maintenance of frontier zones and fortified lines along its southern approaches. The political organization of the kingdom combined royal authority with extensive noble autonomy. The crown held formal sovereignty, but much of the land was controlled by powerful magnates whose local authority limited centralized military coordination. These nobles were obligated to provide troops under feudal arrangements, but the size, quality, and readiness of these forces varied widely. In practice, mobilization depended on negotiation, local interest, and available resources rather than on a standing national army. Hungary did not maintain a permanent, centrally funded military force comparable to those developing in parts of Western Europe. Instead, defense relied on a combination of noble levies, mercenary contingents, and garrison troops assigned to key fortresses. This system could generate substantial numbers during major campaigns, but it lacked consistency and rapid responsiveness. Prolonged or repeated mobilization placed heavy strain on both royal finances and local communities. The southern frontier of the kingdom had long been exposed to pressure. From the late 14th century onward, Ottoman forces expanded steadily through the Balkans, incorporating former Byzantine and Serbian territories. Each stage of this expansion brought Ottoman-controlled lands closer to the Hungarian borders. In response, Hungary developed a system of border fortresses and military districts intended to slow incursions and channel movement along predictable routes. This frontier system functioned unevenly. Some fortresses were well maintained and adequately garrisoned, while others suffered from neglect, insufficient funding, or outdated construction. The cost of maintaining walls, artillery, and personnel was substantial, and royal revenues often proved inadequate to meet these demands across the entire frontier. As a result, defensive strength varied sharply by region and period. Military obligations were further complicated by internal political divisions. Competing noble factions and disputes over succession periodically weakened the crown's ability to coordinate defense. While these divisions did not render the kingdom defenseless, they reduced flexibility and delayed decision-making during periods of crisis. Strategic planning often took place under conditions of limited consensus and constrained resources. Despite these limitations, Hungary remained an active military power before 1526. It participated in regional conflicts, conducted offensive operations along its borders, and maintained diplomatic and military relationships with neighboring states. Its defensive posture was not passive. Fortresses were repaired, troops were raised, and campaigns were undertaken to contest Ottoman advances when resources permitted. The character of warfare along the frontier shaped Hungarian military priorities. Raids, counter-raids, and limited sieges were common. These operations emphasized control of crossings, roads, and fortified points rather than large-scale field battles. Over time, this environment encouraged a defensive orientation focused on holding terrain through fortifications rather than seeking decisive engagements in open battle. Artillery had become an increasingly important factor in warfare by the early 16th century. Cannons were used both in siege operations and in defense, and their presence influenced fortress design and placement. Hungary adopted artillery gradually, integrating it into existing fortifications rather than rebuilding defensive systems from the ground up. This incremental approach reflected financial constraints as well as the continued use of medieval structures. The kingdom's location also shaped its diplomatic position. Hungary stood at the intersection of interests held by the Ottoman Empire, the Habsburg lands, and various regional powers. Diplomatic efforts sought to balance these pressures through alliances, truces, and negotiated settlements. These arrangements provided periods of relative stability, but did not eliminate the underlying strategic tension created by geography. Economic conditions further influenced defensive capacity. Agricultural production supported local garrisons, but long-distance supply networks were limited. Transporting food, weapons, and ammunition to frontier fortresses required functioning roads and secure routes, which were often disrupted during periods of conflict. As a result, many strong points relied heavily on local resources, making them vulnerable to isolation. The population of the kingdom was diverse, encompassing multiple linguistic, cultural, and religious communities. While this diversity did not inherently weaken the state, it added complexity to administration and mobilization. Local loyalties and obligations shaped how communities responded to military demands, particularly during extended campaigns that disrupted normal economic activity. By the early 16th century, these structural conditions produced a defensive system that was functional but fragile. Hungary could resist pressure and absorb limited losses, but its capacity to recover from major defeats was constrained. Loss of territory or key fortresses had cascading effects, reducing revenue, manpower, and strategic depth. Each setback increased the burden on remaining defenses. This fragility was not always apparent during periods of relative calm. Fortresses stood, borders held, and the kingdom continued to operate within established patterns. However, the system depended on maintaining equilibrium across multiple fronts. A decisive disruption in one sector risked undermining the entire structure. As the first decades of the 16th century progressed, pressure along the southern frontier intensified. Ottoman campaigns became larger and more coordinated, supported by growing administrative and logistical capacity. While Hungary adapted where possible, the scale and frequency of these operations increasingly tested the limits of its defensive system. By 1526, the Kingdom of Hungary remained a functioning political and military entity, but one operating under cumulative strain. Its frontier defenses, noble levies, and fortress network reflected decades of adaptation to sustain pressure rather than preparation for a single, decisive confrontation. The balance that had allowed the kingdom to hold its position for generations rested on conditions that could be disrupted rapidly if a major defeat occurred. By the mid-1520s, pressure along the southern approaches to the Kingdom of Hungary had intensified. Ottoman forces operating in the Balkans had consolidated control over much of the region south of the Danube, and the frontiers separating Hungarian-held territory from Ottoman-controlled lands had become increasingly exposed. Military activity along this line escalated as larger forces began to move northward during the campaigning season. In 1526, an Ottoman field army advanced towards central Hungary as part of a broader operational movement. The route taken followed established corridors along rivers and plains that allowed for the movement of large formations and supply trains. Hungarian forces assembled to block this advance, drawing on the same mobilization system that had governed defense for decades. Troops were gathered from noble levies, regional contingents, and available garrisons, forming an army intended to confront the approaching force before it could penetrate deeper into the kingdom. The opposing forces met near the town of Mohács, located on low-lying terrain south of the Danube. The location was shaped by geography rather than fortification. The area consisted largely of open ground interspersed with marshy sections and waterways, offering limited natural protection. The engagement took place on August 29, 1526, within the narrow window imposed by seasonal campaigning and logistical constraints. The Hungarian army entered the confrontation with structural limitations that reflected the conditions described earlier. Its composition was heterogeneous, combining units with varying levels of training, equipment, and cohesion. Command arrangements relied on coordination among noble leaders rather than centralized control. While the assembled force was substantial, it lacked the depth and flexibility required to sustain prolonged engagement against a larger, more standardized opponent. Ottoman forces approached the battlefield with organizational advantages derived from established military systems. Units were arranged according to practiced formations, supported by artillery and auxiliary elements. Movement and deployment reflected prior experience in large-scale engagements across similar terrain. The confrontation unfolded rapidly once contact was made. The engagement did not develop into a prolonged exchange. Within a short period, Hungarian formations were disrupted under pressure from coordinated attacks and artillery support. Attempts to stabilize the line proved ineffective as units became separated and command cohesion deteriorated. The open terrain limited opportunities for defensive repositioning, and retreat routes were constrained by surrounding geographic features. During the course of the fighting, A significant portion of the Hungarian force was destroyed or dispersed. Casualties were severe, and the loss of experienced leaders further weakened the army's ability to reorganize. Among those killed was King Louis II, whose death occurred during the withdrawal phase of the engagement. The loss of the monarch had immediate political implications that extended beyond the battlefield. The defeat at Mohács did not result in the immediate disappearance of the Hungarian state. Administrative structures, regional authorities, and frontier defenses remained in place after the battle. However, the consequences of the defeat were systemic. The destruction of the field army removed the kingdom's primary capacity to contest large-scale advances in open terrain. Replacing this force would require time, resources, and coordination that were not readily available. The death of the king created a vacuum at the center of political authority. Competing claims to the throne emerged, supported by different factions within the nobility and by external powers with interests in the region. This contest over succession delayed coherent decision-making at a moment when rapid coordination was necessary to respond to the altered military situation. In the months following Mohács, Ottoman forces exploited the reduced capacity for organized resistance. Movement through central regions became easier as field opposition had largely ceased. While not all fortresses were immediately threatened or taken, the balance between offense and defense shifted decisively. Positions that had previously relied on the expectation of relief from a field army now faced isolation. The impact of the defeat extended to the frontier system as a whole. Fortresses depended on the surrounding political and military framework to function effectively. Garrison positions could delay advances, but they were not designed to operate indefinitely without external support. The loss of the field army undermined the strategic depth that allowed these fortifications to serve as part of an integrated defense. Financial and administrative consequences followed. Revenues that supported garrisons and repairs were disrupted as territories changed hands or fell under competing authorities. Mobilization systems based on noble obligation were strained by the ongoing succession dispute. The capacity to coordinate regional defense declined as attention shifted toward internal political resolution. The period after Mohács was marked by fragmentation rather than collapse. Authority did not vanish, but it became divided and contested. Different regions responded according to local conditions, resources, and leadership. Some fortresses remained operational, while others were neglected or surrendered under pressure. The defensive network persisted, but in a weakened and uneven form. From a military perspective, Mohács altered the strategic environment in which future operations would occur. Large-scale field confrontation in open terrain became increasingly risky for Hungarian forces lacking comparable organization and support. Defense shifted further toward reliance on fortifications, terrain, and delay rather than direct engagement. This adjustment reflected necessity rather than doctrine. By the end of 1526, the Kingdom of Hungary continued to exist as a political entity, but its capacity to act as a unified military power had been sharply reduced. The defeat at Mohács had removed critical elements of coordination, leadership, and field capability. What followed was not immediate disintegration, but a prolonged period of instability in which existing structures struggled to adapt to new conditions. Following the defeat at Mohács in 1526, the political and territorial configuration of the Kingdom of Hungary entered a prolonged period of instability. The battle had removed the kingdom's primary field army and its monarch, but it did not produce an immediate or uniform transfer of control. Instead, authority fragmented over time as competing claims, external pressures, and regional conditions reshaped governance across Hungarian lands. In the months after Mohács, the absence of a clear successor created a contested political environment. Different factions within the Hungarian nobility supported rival claimants to the throne, each drawing legitimacy from existing legal traditions and dynastic ties. This internal division delayed coordinated responses to the altered strategic situation and weakened the ability to concentrate resources along any single defensive line. At the same time, Ottoman forces moved through parts of central Hungary with limited organized resistance. These movements did not immediately establish permanent administration across all occupied areas, but they disrupted existing structures and reduced the crown's capacity to reassert control. Towns and fortresses responded according to local circumstances, with outcomes varying by region, leadership, and available resources. By the late 1520s and 1530s, Hungary's territory had begun to separate into three overlapping spheres of authority. This division was not the result of a single agreement or decisive campaign, but of cumulative developments unfolding over more than a decade. The first sphere consisted of central Hungary, where Ottoman military presence became increasingly entrenched. Control in these areas was exercised through garrisons, administrative officials, and integration into existing Ottoman provincial systems. Major towns and key routes were secured to support movement, taxation, and further operations. This region formed the core of what later became known as Ottoman Hungary. The second sphere was Royal Hungary, encompassing western and northern territories that came under the authority of the Habsburg dynasty. These lands included regions closer to Austria and Bohemia, where Habsburg resources and administrative structures could be applied more directly. Governance in Royal Hungary emphasized fortress defense, taxation to support garrisons, and coordination with neighboring Habsburg territories. However, these areas were not insulated from conflict and remained exposed to ongoing military pressure. The third sphere emerged in the east, where Transylvania developed as a distinct political entity, governed by local elites and later formalized as a principality. Transylvania operated under Ottoman suzerainty while retaining internal autonomy. Its rulers balanced obligations to the Ottoman Empire with local administrative control, creating a buffer zone between Ottoman-held lands and Habsburg territory. Between 1526 and 1541, the boundaries separating these three spheres were neither fixed nor clearly defined. Fortresses changed hands, allegiances shifted, and military operations continued across contested zones. Control over territory often depended less on formal claims than on the ability to maintain garrisons, supply troops, and respond to local challenges. This fluidity placed significant strain on the existing fortress network. Defensive planning required clarity of command and predictable support, both of which were undermined by divided authority. Fortresses that had once operated as components of a unified system now found themselves isolated within competing jurisdictions. Some were reinforced, while others were neglected due to uncertainty over responsibility and funding. Administrative fragmentation also affected taxation and logistics. Revenues that previously supported frontier defenses were disrupted as territories passed between authorities or fell into contested status. Supply routes became less reliable, and coordination between regions declined. These conditions reduced the capacity to repair fortifications, replace equipment, and sustain garrisons over extended periods. Military operations during this period were characterized by intermittent campaigning rather than continuous occupation across all regions. Raids, sieges, and counter-movements occurred alongside periods of relative inactivity, shaped by seasonal constraints and resource availability. Each authority focused on securing positions most critical to its immediate interests, rather than maintaining a comprehensive defense of former Hungarian territory. The culmination of this process occurred in 1541, when Ottoman forces secured control over Buda, the former royal capital. This event formalized the division that had already been developing. Central Hungary was incorporated more directly into the Ottoman administrative system, while Royal Hungary and Transylvania continued to function as separate political entities under different forms of external influence. By this point, the tripartite division of Hungary had become a defining feature of the region's political landscape. The former kingdom no longer operated as a single defensive unit. Instead, its territories were governed according to divergent priorities, administrative systems, and military capabilities. For frontier defense, this division carried long-term consequences. Coordination across the former kingdom became more difficult, and responsibility for resisting further expansion shifted increasingly toward regional strongpoints. Fortresses located near the boundaries between these spheres assumed greater importance, as they now marked transitions between competing systems of control. The defensive burden that had once been distributed across a unified realm was now concentrated unevenly. Some regions benefited from stronger external support, while others relied on limited local resources. This imbalance shaped how fortifications were maintained, how garrisons were supplied, and how long resistance could be sustained during future operations. By the early 1540s, Hungary existed as a fragmented space defined by overlapping authorities and contested frontiers. The patterns of warfare, administration, and defense that emerged from this division would persist for decades. Within this environment, individual fortresses assumed roles determined less by national strategy than by their position within a fractured and shifting political order. By the early decades of the 16th century, Ottoman military activity in Central Europe followed patterns shaped by administrative capacity, geography, and long-established methods of campaigning. Expansion into the Carpathian Basin did not occur through a single continuous advance, but through repeated operations conducted within defined seasonal limits. These operations were designed to secure territory incrementally while maintaining stable supply and governance. Campaigns were organized around predictable annual cycles. Large-scale military movements typically began in spring and concluded by autumn, reflecting the need to supply armies operating far from core administrative centers. Roads, river routes, and storage depots played a central role in determining where and how forces could move. Control of key junctions and fortified positions was therefore essential to sustaining operations over multiple years. Ottoman strategy in the region emphasized the reduction of fortified obstacles rather than the pursuit of decisive field battles whenever possible. Fortresses controlled movement, protected supply routes, and anchored administrative authority. As long as these positions remained in hostile hands, further advance carried logistical risk. Consequently, siege warfare formed the backbone of Ottoman operations in Hungary and its borderlands. This approach required extensive preparation. Artillery, engineering personnel, and specialized support units accompanied field armies. Siege trains were assembled months in advance, and routes were selected to accommodate their movement. The presence of such assets indicated intent to reduce fortified positions systematically rather than rely on rapid maneuver alone. Administration followed military success. Once a territory was secured, it was incorporated into an existing provincial framework. Garrison towns became centers for taxation, supply distribution, and further operations. This integration allowed occupied regions to support subsequent campaigns, reducing the strain on distant supply lines and enabling a sustained presence. The strategy also relied on layered defense and offense. Newly secured fortresses formed part of a chain extending outward from core territories. Each position supported the next, creating depth that protected supply routes and limited the effectiveness of counterattacks. Over time, this system allowed Ottoman forces to operate with increasing confidence farther from their original bases. Operations in Central Europe during the 1530s and 1540s reflected this method. Campaigns targeted specific regions rather than attempting comprehensive conquest in a single season. Some years focused on consolidating gains, repairing fortifications, and adjusting administrative boundaries. Other years saw renewed offensives aimed at expanding control along strategic corridors. Coordination among different military elements was essential. Field armies operated alongside garrisons already stationed in occupied territories. Communication between these forces allowed for flexibility in response to local conditions. If resistance was encountered at one point, resources could be redirected and operations adjusted without abandoning broader objectives. The use of vassal or semi-autonomous territories also played a role. Buffer regions reduced the direct exposure of core provinces and complicated the defensive planning of opponents. These areas absorbed pressure and provided additional resources without requiring full administrative integration. By the middle of the century, this strategy had produced a stable Ottoman presence across much of central Hungary. The frontier shifted gradually northward, but progress was measured rather than rapid. Each advance depended on securing the infrastructure necessary to sustain it. Where fortresses resisted effectively or where supply became strained, operations slowed or paused. This measured pace reflected calculation rather than hesitation. Maintaining control over newly acquired territory required time and resources. Overextension risked isolating forces and undermining earlier gains. As a result, advances were often followed by periods of consolidation during which administrative systems were strengthened and defenses improved. The cumulative effect of this approach was to place increasing pressure on remaining defensive positions beyond the frontier. Fortresses that had once been supported by a unified defensive system now faced a coordinated opponent capable of returning repeatedly with prepared resources. Resistance could delay progress, but it rarely altered the strategic logic guiding operations. By the early 1550s, Ottoman strategy in Central Europe had reached a stage where further expansion depended on removing specific obstacles rather than overcoming a single opposing force. Remaining strong points along key routes assumed heightened importance. Their continued occupation constrained movement and disrupted the cohesion of the expanding frontier system. This strategic environment set the conditions for operations undertaken in 1552. Decisions about where to apply pressure were shaped by the existing network of fortresses, the availability of supply routes, and the need to maintain continuity between occupied regions. Individual sites were selected not for symbolic reasons, but because their removal would improve operational flexibility and administrative reach. Within this framework, the focus of military planning shifted towards specific objectives whose capture would strengthen the overall structure of control. The selection of targets followed from established practice rather than exceptional circumstances. The campaign logic that governed earlier decades continued to operate, directing attention toward remaining fortified positions that constrained further advance. By the early 1550s, the strategic environment in northern and central Hungary had been reshaped by more than 2 decades of incremental change. The tripartite division of the former kingdom had stabilized into a working, though contested, order. Central regions were administered through Ottoman provincial structures. Western and northern areas were organized under Habsburg authority, and Transylvania functioned as a semi-autonomous entity aligned with Ottoman interests. Within this framework, military planning increasingly focused on resolving specific geographic constraints rather than pursuing broad territorial claims. Ottoman operations in the years preceding 1552 reflected this narrowing of focus. Campaigns were directed toward improving the continuity of controlled territory, securing supply routes, and reducing isolated defensive positions that disrupted movement. The logic guiding these decisions was practical and cumulative. Each unresolved strongpoint along key corridors imposed costs on logistics, administration, and future operations. Northern Hungary occupied a particular position within this strategic landscape. The region formed a transitional zone between Ottoman-controlled central areas and Habsburg-held territories further west and north. Movement through this zone relied on a limited number of routes shaped by terrain, river valleys, and existing road networks. Control over these routes affected not only military movement, but also communication and supply across the frontier. The fortress at Eger was situated within this transitional zone. Its location placed it near routes connecting the central plains to the northern uplands and beyond. While it was not the largest or most modern fortress in the region, its position allowed it to influence movement across a broad area. As long as it remained in hostile hands, operations moving northward or westward faced increased risk and delay. In the years before 1552, Ottoman forces had secured or neutralized several other positions that once served similar functions. Each successful operation reduced the number of obstacles along established corridors. As this process continued, remaining fortresses assumed greater relative importance, even if their intrinsic strength had not changed. Their continued occupation represented unresolved gaps in an otherwise expanding system of control. Eger's status within the defensive network of Royal Hungary also shaped its vulnerability. The fortress depended on regional coordination for supply, reinforcement, and repair. By the early 1550s, such coordination was constrained by distance, competing priorities, and limited resources. The ability to relieve a besieged position in northern Hungary had diminished as other defensive commitments absorbed available forces. The administrative division of Hungary further complicated support for frontier fortresses. Responsibility for defense was fragmented across jurisdictions, each operating under different fiscal and military arrangements. Decisions about where to allocate funds, troops, and material were shaped by local pressures rather than by a unified strategy. As a result, some positions were strengthened while others remained comparatively exposed. Within this environment, Eger functioned as a forward position anchoring the northern defensive line. Its continued occupation restricted movement between central and northern regions and required Ottoman forces to account for its presence in operational planning. Any campaign that bypassed the fortress risked leaving a hostile garrison capable of disrupting communications and supply lines. By 1552, the accumulation of these factors made Eger a logical operational objective. The decision to target it followed established strategic practice rather than representing a departure from earlier methods. Reducing the fortress would simplify movement across the region, improve the cohesion of controlled territory, and reduce the need for defensive precautions along adjacent routes. The timing of the operation also reflected practical considerations. Campaign seasons were finite, and objectives were selected based on feasibility within available time and resources. Eger was accessible via existing routes, lay within reach of supporting garrisons, and could be approached without requiring extensive preliminary operations against other strongpoints. These conditions made it suitable for inclusion within the campaign plan. The selection of Eger did not imply that its capture alone would resolve all frontier challenges. Rather, it represented one step within a broader sequence of actions intended to reduce friction along the boundary between Ottoman and Habsburg-held territories. Each step aimed to improve operational flexibility and administrative reach incrementally. From the perspective of Royal Hungary, Eger's role had also evolved. As other positions were lost or weakened, the fortress assumed greater importance within a shrinking defensive network. Its continued occupation helped compensate for earlier losses by maintaining a degree of control over northern routes. This increasing reliance on a limited number of strongpoints heightened the consequences of any individual siege. The geography surrounding Eger further influenced its selection. The fortress stood near valleys and passes that concentrated movement. While alternative routes existed, they were less direct or more difficult to sustain for large forces. Control of the area around Eger, therefore, affected the efficiency of movement rather than merely its possibility. By the opening of the 1552 campaign, the strategic calculus surrounding Eger had become clear. Its capture would not represent a dramatic breakthrough, but it would remove a persistent obstacle and reduce the complexity of future operations. Its continued resistance, conversely, would impose delays and require additional resources to contain. By the middle of the 16th century, the fortress at Eger reflected a long process of adaptation to frontier warfare rather than a single, comprehensive program of modernization. Its physical form was shaped by medieval origins, incremental repairs, and selective reinforcement carried out under conditions of limited resources. Understanding its design and limitations is essential to explaining how it functioned during the Siege of 1552. The fortress occupied elevated ground overlooking the surrounding valleys. This position provided clear lines of sight across nearby approaches and constrained the movement of forces attempting to reach the walls. Elevation offered defensive advantages by increasing the difficulty of direct assault and by extending the effective range of defensive fire. At the same time, the surrounding terrain did not prevent the approach entirely. Valleys and roads still allowed attacking forces to bring artillery within range, particularly once positions were secured and cleared. Eger's fortifications developed over several centuries. The core of the structure consisted of medieval stone walls and towers designed for defense against infantry assaults and limited siege equipment. These elements emphasized height and solidity rather than low profiles or angled surfaces. Such designs had been effective in earlier periods, but were increasingly vulnerable to sustained artillery fire by the 16th century. In response to changing conditions, portions of the fortress had been reinforced. Some walls were thickened, and earth was added in places to absorb the impact of cannon fire. Internal spaces were reorganized to improve movement and supply within the enclosure. These measures reflected awareness of emerging siege techniques, but they were applied unevenly and did not transform the fortress into a fully modern defensive work. The fortress did not conform to the principles of the Trace Italienne that were being adopted in parts of Western and Southern Europe. Bastioned systems with angled walls, low profiles, and interlocking fields of fire required substantial investment and extensive reconstruction. Such projects exceeded the financial and logistical capacity available at Eger. As a result, many sections of the fortress retained vertical stone walls that were susceptible to prolonged bombardment. Artillery platforms within the fortress were limited. Defensive guns could be mounted along the walls, but space and elevation restricted their deployment. This constrained the ability to deliver sustained counter-battery fire against attacking artillery positioned at a distance. While defenders could disrupt assault formations and harass siege works, they could not easily neutralize enemy guns once those guns were securely emplaced. The internal layout of the fortress reflected its layered development. Buildings, courtyards, and storage areas were arranged according to earlier needs rather than a unified defensive plan. Movement within the walls could be managed, but bottlenecks existed, particularly during periods of intense activity. These conditions affected how quickly supplies, ammunition, and personnel could be shifted in response to damage or assault. Water supply represented a critical consideration. Like many fortresses of the period, Eger relied on internal wells and stored reserves. These sources were sufficient for normal garrison use, but were not designed to support a significantly expanded population for extended periods without careful management. Prolonged isolation increased pressure on these systems and required strict control of consumption. The fortress perimeter included multiple sections with varying degrees of strength. Some walls faced terrain that limited approach, while others were more exposed. Attackers could select points where artillery could be brought closer or where the angle of fire was more favorable. Defenders were required to distribute limited manpower across the entire perimeter, reducing the ability to concentrate force at any single location. Maintenance of the fortress depended on regular funding and skilled labor. By the mid-16th century, these resources were unevenly available. Repairs were often reactive rather than preventative, carried out in response to immediate threats rather than as part of long-term planning. This approach preserved basic functionality but left underlying weaknesses unaddressed. The relationship between the fortress and its surrounding settlements also shaped defensive capacity. Nearby towns and agricultural areas provided food and labor during peacetime, but these connections were severed once a siege began. Isolation removed access to external support and forced reliance on pre-existing stores and internal organization. Despite these limitations, the fortress retained functional defensive value. Its walls could not be reduced instantly, and its elevation complicated direct assault. Attackers were required to invest time and resources to establish siege works, deploy artillery, and create breaches. This capacity to delay operations made the fortress relevant within the broader defensive network, even if it could not be considered impregnable. The design of Eger, therefore, presented a mixed profile. It was neither obsolete nor fully modern. Its strengths lie in position, accumulated reinforcement, and the ability to absorb damage over time. Its weaknesses lie in outdated structural elements, limited artillery capacity, and constraints imposed by internal layout and supply. In the context of 16th-century warfare, such a fortress occupied a common position. Many strong points along the Hungarian frontier shared similar characteristics, reflecting the difficulty of maintaining up-to-date defenses across a wide and contested region. Eger differed not in kind, but in degree, combining advantages and vulnerabilities that would shape the course of any siege conducted against it. By the time it became an operational objective in 1552, the fortress stood as a defensible but exposed position. Its survival would depend less on architectural perfection than on how effectively its existing features could be used under sustained pressure. This physical reality defined the parameters within which the events of the siege would unfold. By 1552, the fortress at Eger was occupied by a garrison whose composition reflected the broader conditions of defense in northern Hungary. The men and non-combatants within the walls did not represent a uniform or purpose-built force assembled for a single campaign. Instead, they formed a contingent shaped by long-term frontier pressures, limited resources, and the administrative realities of Royal Hungary. The total number of people inside the fortress at the outset of the siege is estimated at approximately 2,000 to 2,100, including soldiers, support personnel, and civilians who had not evacuated before isolation. This figure was not exceptional for a frontier strongpoint of Eger's size, but it was small relative to the scale of forces that could be brought against it. The garrison's size reflected what local authorities could sustain rather than what ideal defensive planning would have prescribed. The military component of the garrison consisted of several distinct elements. Core defenders included Hungarian soldiers assigned to the fortress as part of the regional defensive system. Alongside them were mercenary troops, primarily of German origin, employed under contract. Such mercenaries were a common feature of 16th-century warfare in Central Europe, providing trained manpower where local forces were insufficient or unavailable. These soldiers varied in experience and specialization. Some had previous exposure to siege conditions and frontier fighting, while others had more limited service backgrounds. Equipment levels were uneven. Firearms, melee weapons, and protective gear were present but not standardized across the garrison. Ammunition stocks were finite and could not be replenished once the fortress was isolated. Command and organization within the fortress followed the established military hierarchy. Officers were responsible for assigning positions along the walls, coordinating watches, and managing supplies. Orders were transmitted through direct command rather than through complex staff structures. Communication depended on physical proximity and prearranged routines, reflecting the confined environment of the fortress. In addition to soldiers, a significant number of non-combatants were present. These included craftsmen, laborers, family members of soldiers, and other civilians who lived in or near the fortress under normal conditions. Their presence was not unusual. Frontier fortresses often functioned as small communities, particularly in regions where external security was uncertain. The roles of non-combatants during a siege were primarily supportive. Tasks included food preparation, water distribution, maintenance of internal spaces, and assistance in moving supplies and ammunition. These activities were essential to sustaining the garrison, but did not involve direct participation in combat operations. Later literary accounts would amplify these roles, but contemporary evidence supports their logistical nature. Supply conditions inside the fortress were constrained from the outset. Food stocks had been accumulated during peacetime, but quantities were limited by storage capacity and available resources. These supplies were intended to sustain a garrison of normal size for a finite period, not to support an expanded population under prolonged isolation. Careful management was therefore required once external access was cut off. Water availability depended on internal sources. Wells and stored reserves provided a basic supply, but usage had to be regulated. Damage to infrastructure during bombardment could further strain access. Maintaining water distribution under siege conditions was as critical as managing food and ammunition, as shortages could rapidly undermine defensive capacity. Medical care within the fortress was rudimentary by modern standards. Treatment relied on available practitioners and basic remedies. Injuries sustained during bombardment or assault added to the burden on limited facilities. There was no capacity for evacuation, and recovery depended on conditions within the walls. The accumulation of wounded placed additional pressure on supplies and manpower. Morale, while often emphasized in later narratives, can be assessed only indirectly through observable conditions. Discipline, adherence to orders, and continued execution of assigned tasks indicate that organizational structures remained functional. There is no evidence of widespread breakdown or refusal of duty during the early stages of the siege. This continuity reflected established routines rather than exceptional circumstances. The garrison's ability to respond to an attack depended on coordinated use of limited manpower. Defenders were assigned to sectors of the wall based on exposure and threat. Rotations were implemented where possible to manage fatigue, though the scope for rest was limited. Each breach or damaged section required redistribution of personnel, further stretching available forces. Ammunition management was a central concern. Firearms and artillery within the fortress could inflict damage on attacking troops, but supplies of powder and shot were finite. Decisions about when and where to employ these weapons had to balance immediate defensive needs against the risk of depletion. This constraint shaped tactical responses throughout the siege. The presence of civilians affected internal dynamics without determining them. Space within the fortress was shared, and shelter had to be organized to protect non-combatants from bombardment. This required allocation of areas away from the walls and active firing positions. Managing these arrangements added complexity to internal organization but did not alter the fundamental structure of command. The garrison at Eger did not expect relief once the siege began. Available forces in the region were committed elsewhere, and distance limited rapid response. This expectation shaped defensive planning. Preparations assumed that resistance would depend entirely on resources and organization within the walls rather than on external intervention. Coordination between soldiers and support personnel was therefore essential. Tasks such as reinforcing damaged sections with earth and debris required collective labor. These activities were undertaken as part of standard defensive practice rather than as extraordinary measures. Similar procedures were employed in other frontier fortresses facing artillery siege. The composition of the garrison also reflected the broader social and military environment of Royal Hungary. Frontier defense relied on a mix of local obligation, contracted service, and communal support. This system did not produce uniformly equipped or trained forces, but it allowed fortresses to be held with limited resources over extended periods. By the time the Ottoman army completed its deployment around Eger in 1552, the men and non-combatants inside the walls were operating within well-defined constraints. Their numbers were limited, supplies were finite, and reinforcement was improbable. Organization, routine, and resource management determined how long resistance could be sustained. By late summer 1552, Ottoman military activity in northern and central Hungary had entered a new operational phase. Preparations made earlier in the year translated into the movement of a field army toward remaining defensive positions along the frontier. This movement followed established corridors shaped by terrain, road networks, and prior occupation, reflecting patterns that had governed campaigning in the region for decades. The force approaching Eger was not assembled specifically for a single isolated objective. It formed part of a broader campaign conducted during the same season, in which multiple fortresses and routes were addressed in sequence. Units converged from different directions, drawing on garrisons already stationed in occupied territory, as well as formations mobilized for the campaign. The resulting army combined infantry, cavalry, artillery, and specialized support elements. Modern historical estimates place the size of the Ottoman force at approximately 35,000 to 40,000, though contemporary sources recorded higher figures. Such variation reflects the conventions of 16th-century reporting rather than precise accounting. Regardless of the exact number, the scale of the force exceeded that of the garrison at Eger by a wide margin and was sufficient to conduct a formal siege supported by sustained operations. Command of the army was distributed among senior officials responsible for coordinating different components of the force. Authority was exercised through established hierarchies rather than ad hoc leadership. Orders were transmitted through command chains that had been tested in earlier campaigns, allowing for coordinated movement and deployment. This structure enabled the army to operate over extended distances while maintaining cohesion. Artillery played a central role in the approaching force. Cannons of varying calibers were transported with the army, accompanied by crews trained in their operation and by personnel responsible for the construction of firing positions. The movement of these guns required secure routes and careful timing. Roads had to support heavy loads, and suitable ground had to be identified for emplacement once the destination was reached. Engineering units and laborers accompanied the main body of troops. Their tasks included preparing camps, clearing approaches, constructing siege works, and maintaining supply lines. These functions were essential to sustaining operations and reflected the administrative depth supporting the army. Siege warfare depended not only on combat units, but on the ability to modify terrain and infrastructure as required. Logistical support for the army drew on multiple sources. Supplies were carried with the force, requisitioned locally, or transported along established routes from controlled territories. Rivers and roads facilitated the movement of food, fodder, and ammunition. The presence of an existing network of garrisons reduced the need to rely exclusively on long-distance supply from core regions. As the army advanced, its movement affected the surrounding areas. Fields were cleared, routes secured, and settlements within range of the line of march were brought under control. These actions reduced the possibility of interference with supply and communication. Once the army reached the vicinity of Eger, these measures ensured that the fortress would be isolated from external support. The approach to Eger was deliberate rather than rapid. Reconnaissance preceded major movement, allowing commanders to assess terrain and identify suitable locations for camps and artillery positions. The objective was to arrive in sufficient strength, establish control over the surrounding area, and prepare for siege operations without exposing the force to unnecessary risk. Upon reaching the region around the fortress, the army began to deploy in stages. Camps were established at locations offering access to water, forage, and defensible ground. Units were assigned sectors corresponding to different sections of the fortress perimeter. This distribution allowed for continuous pressure and reduced the likelihood of unguarded approaches. Communication between units relied on established signaling methods and direct contact among officers. Coordination was necessary to manage the placement of artillery, the timing of bombardment, and the movement of assault forces once operations commenced. These arrangements were put in place before active engagement began. The arrival of such a force altered the immediate environment around Eger. Roads leading to the fortress were secured or blocked, and movement in the surrounding countryside ceased. Any remaining civilians in nearby settlements were displaced or incorporated into the logistical system supporting the army. From this point onward, the fortress was fully isolated. The presence of artillery and engineering personnel indicated that the intention was to reduce the fortress through sustained pressure rather than to rely on negotiation or demonstration alone. Siege operations required time, preparation, and coordination. The approaching army possessed the material and organizational capacity to conduct such an operation. At this stage, no direct assault was undertaken. Standard practice dictated that preparation precede engagement. Guns had to be emplaced, lines of communication secured, and supply arrangements stabilized. Only once these conditions were met would bombardment begin. The approach of the Ottoman army, therefore, marked a transition from strategic planning to operational execution. The conditions under which the siege would unfold were being established systematically. The imbalance of forces was clear, but the outcome depended on how these forces would be employed over time. By early September 1552, the Ottoman army surrounding Eger had completed the preparatory phase of siege operations. Camps were established, supply arrangements stabilized, and the terrain around the fortress was brought under control. With these conditions in place, attention shifted from movement and deployment to the systematic application of force against the fortifications. The opening phase of the siege followed established procedures. Artillery was positioned at locations selected for range, angle, and ground stability. These positions were chosen to allow sustained fire against sections of the fortress perimeter judged most vulnerable to bombardment. Preparation of gun platforms required clearing vegetation, leveling ground, and constructing earthworks capable of supporting heavy cannon and absorbing recoil. The initial bombardment began once these positions were secured. Fire was directed against the outer walls rather than at gates or towers alone. The objective was to weaken structural integrity over time by repeated impact rather than to achieve immediate collapse. Stone walls designed for earlier forms of warfare were susceptible to this method, but damage accumulated gradually rather than instantaneously. Cannon fire proceeded in measured sequences. Guns were fired in rotation to manage heat, preserve equipment, and conserve ammunition. Crews adjusted aim based on observed impact, focusing on points where stonework showed signs of cracking or displacement. This process required time and continuous observation, as the effectiveness of artillery depended on sustained application rather than brief intensity. Within the fortress, the effects of bombardment became apparent as masonry was damaged and debris accumulated along the interior of the walls. Breaches did not open immediately. Instead, cracks widened, sections weakened, and defensive surfaces deteriorated incrementally. Each impact altered the condition of the wall, increasing the burden on those responsible for internal defense. The defenders responded according to standard practice. Areas struck by artillery were reinforced from within using earth, timber, and rubble. This work reduced the likelihood that a breach would provide a direct opening for assault. Earth-filled barriers absorbed impact more effectively than stone alone and could be constructed rapidly using available materials. These internal works transformed damaged sections of the wall into layered defenses. Even where external stonework was compromised, attackers would still be required to overcome additional obstacles before entering the fortress. This adaptation was a common response to artillery siege and reflected accumulated experience from earlier engagements along the frontier. The bombardment continued over successive days. The rhythm of fire was shaped by supply considerations, maintenance needs, and the progress of damage. Artillery crews paused to repair equipment, reposition guns, or adjust platforms as ground conditions changed. These interruptions were part of routine siege conduct rather than signs of difficulty. Inside the fortress, routine was altered by the demands of constant repair. Manpower was reassigned from other duties to reinforce threatened sections. Movement within the walls increased as materials were transported to points of impact. These activities required coordination to avoid congestion and to maintain readiness along other parts of the perimeter. The psychological effect of bombardment, often emphasized in later accounts, is difficult to assess directly. What can be observed is that organizational functions continued. Watches were maintained, orders were carried out, and repairs proceeded despite the ongoing fire. There is no evidence from this phase of the siege that internal discipline or coordination collapsed under bombardment. The use of artillery also affected the surrounding environment. Smoke, debris, and noise marked the transition from preparation to active engagement. The countryside around Eger, already secured by the besieging army, now served primarily as a zone supporting siege operations. Supply wagons, ammunition transport, and labor movements increased as the siege intensified. The opening bombardment did not produce immediate results in terms of access. No large-scale assault followed the initial phase. This reflected standard doctrine. Bombardment was intended to prepare the fortress for later action by weakening defenses and forcing defenders to expend labor and materials on repair. Assault would follow only once conditions favored success. Throughout September, artillery fire was adjusted based on observation. When a section of the wall showed signs of greater vulnerability, fire was concentrated there. When defenders reinforced a damaged area effectively, attention could shift elsewhere. This interaction shaped the evolving geometry of the siege, with both sides responding to visible changes. The limitations of artillery were also apparent. Guns could damage walls, but could not, by themselves, secure control of the fortress. Weather, ammunition supply, and equipment were imposed constraints on the intensity and duration of fire. These factors required careful management to sustain pressure over time. As the bombardment progressed, the fortress remained intact but altered. External walls bore visible damage. and internal defenses became more complex as layers were added behind weakened sections. The defenders' ability to adapt to damage prevented rapid exploitation by the attackers. By the end of the opening bombardment phase in September 1552, the siege had entered a sustained pattern. Artillery had demonstrated its capacity to degrade the fortress, but had not yet created a decisive opening. The groundwork had been laid for subsequent phases involving intensified fire and direct assault. As the bombardment continued into the latter part of September 1552, the Siege of Eger entered a phase characterized by repeated assaults, sustained attrition, and increasing strain on both the attacking army and the defenders within the fortress. These developments followed patterns typical of prolonged siege warfare in the 16th century, where progress was measured less by decisive moments than by the cumulative effects of pressure over time. Once sections of the outer walls showed sufficient damage, Ottoman forces initiated direct attacks against selected points of the perimeter. These assaults were not continuous or indiscriminate. They were launched after periods of bombardment intended to weaken defenses and exhaust the labor required for repair. The timing and location of each attack reflected assessments of where resistance might be most effectively tested. Assault units advanced toward breaches or heavily damaged sections under covering fire. Movement across open ground exposed attackers to defensive fire from within the fortress, limiting the speed and cohesion of advance. The structure of the walls and the elevation of the fortress complicated the approach, requiring attackers to concentrate at narrow points where access was possible. When assaults reached the damaged sections of the wall, fighting became localized and congested. Breaches created by artillery were often incomplete, obstructed by rubble and reinforced internally with earth and timber. These conditions slowed movement and reduced the effectiveness of the numerical advantage. Attackers were required to clear obstacles while under fire, a process that consumed time and manpower. Defenders responded by concentrating limited forces at threatened points. Personnel were shifted from quieter sections of the wall to reinforce areas under attack. This redistribution required careful coordination to avoid leaving other sectors exposed. Defensive fire was directed at approach routes and breach zones to disrupt formations and delay progress. These engagements were repeated over several weeks. No single assault achieved a decisive breakthrough. Each attempt imposed costs on both sides. Attacking units suffered casualties during approach and close combat, while defenders incurred losses from artillery fire and direct engagement. Damage to the fortress continued, increasing the workload required to maintain internal defenses. Attrition affected resources as well as manpower. Ammunition was expended steadily. Tools and materials used for repair wore out or were destroyed. Food and water consumption continued under conditions of isolation. Medical capacity within the fortress was stretched by the accumulation of wounded. On the attacking side, sustaining large numbers of troops in fixed positions placed ongoing demands on supply and organization. The pace of operations reflected these constraints. Periods of assault were followed by intervals during which bombardment resumed or repairs were made. These cycles allowed both sides to recover partially while preparing for subsequent action. The siege did not progress linearly, but through repeated phases of pressure and response. Morale, as it can be assessed through observable behavior, remained tied to organizational function rather than emotional expression. Within the fortress, command structures continued to operate. Orders were executed, repairs were carried out, and defensive positions were maintained. There is no evidence from this phase of the siege of breakdown in discipline or abandonment of assigned duties. On the attacking side, the continuation of operations indicates that command coordination remained intact. Assaults were organized and supported according to plan, and artillery continued to be employed systematically. At the same time, repeated failure to secure entry increased the time and resources committed to the operation. Civilian involvement within the fortress during this phase remained primarily logistical. Non-combatants assisted with the transport of supplies, preparation of food, and maintenance of internal spaces. Contemporary documentation supports these activities as part of routine siege defense. Later literary accounts would depict civilians engaging directly in combat, but such portrayals extend beyond what can be confirmed by 16th-century sources. As September gave way to October, external conditions began to influence the conduct of the siege more strongly. Shorter daylight hours reduced the time available for sustained operations. Weather conditions affected ground stability, complicating movement and the maintenance of siege works. These factors did not halt operations, but added to existing constraints. The cumulative effect of repeated assaults and ongoing bombardment altered the condition of the fortress. Walls were weakened in multiple locations, and internal defenses became increasingly complex as layers of reinforcement were added. This complexity increased the labor required to sustain defense, but also reduced the effectiveness of any single breach. For the attacking army, attrition was not limited to combat losses. The longer the siege continued, the greater the burden on logistics, discipline, and coordination. Maintaining large forces in a fixed position required constant effort to supply food, fodder, and ammunition. Any disruption to these systems reduced operational efficiency. Despite sustained pressure, no decisive turning point occurred during this phase. Assaults tested defenses but did not overcome them. Bombardment degraded the walls but did not open uncontested access. Both sides remained engaged in a process defined by endurance rather than rapid resolution. By the latter part of October 1552, the siege had reached a stage where further progress depended on changes in conditions rather than repetition of earlier actions. The defenders continued to hold damaged but functional positions. The attackers faced increasing costs associated with continued operation. By October 1552, the Siege of Eger had reached a point where its continuation depended less on additional force and more on whether existing constraints could be overcome. The failure of the siege was not the result of a single event or error. It emerged from the interaction of multiple limiting factors that accumulated over the course of the operation and progressively reduced the effectiveness of further action. One of the primary constraints was time. Ottoman campaigns in Central Europe operated within seasonal limits. Large armies depended on predictable weather, passable roads, and available forage. As the campaign extended into October, daylight hours shortened and conditions deteriorated. These changes reduced the window for sustained daily operations and complicated coordination across dispersed siege positions. Logistical strain increased steadily as the siege continued. Supplying a large force concentrated in one location required continuous movement of food, fodder, ammunition, and replacement equipment. Although the Ottoman logistical system was capable of supporting extended operations, prolonged commitment at a single site increased demand on local resources and transport networks. Each additional week required greater effort to maintain the supply at the level necessary for active siege warfare. The effectiveness of artillery, while significant, also faced practical limits. Cannon fire damaged walls and forced defenders to commit labor and materials to repair, but it did not produce a rapid or uncontested opening. Walls were weakened incrementally rather than collapsing outright. Internal earthworks and barricades absorbed impact and reduced the value of newly created breaches. As a result, artillery alone could not secure access to the interior of the fortress. Repeated assaults failed to capitalize on the damage inflicted by bombardment. Breaches were obstructed, approach routes were constrained, and attackers were required to advance through narrow, exposed zones. These conditions reduced the advantage of numerical superiority and imposed consistent losses without yielding decisive results. Each unsuccessful assault increased the cost of continued action. The adaptability of the defense further limited progress. The defenders responded to damage by reallocating manpower, reinforcing threatened sections, and modifying internal layouts to absorb shock. These actions did not restore the original condition of the walls, but they prevented rapid exploitation. The ability to convert damaged stonework into layered earth defenses altered the balance between destruction and access. Environmental factors compounded these difficulties. Weather conditions affected the stability of siege works, artillery platforms, and approach routes. Wet ground complicated movement and maintenance. These factors did not halt operations outright, but they increased the labor required to sustain them and reduced operational efficiency. The accumulation of attrition also shaped the outcome. Losses incurred during bombardment and assault reduced the pool of personnel available for further action. Equipment wear, damage, and depletion affected both artillery and support systems. Over time, these effects diminished the capacity to apply pressure at the same intensity maintained earlier in the siege. Strategic considerations beyond Eger also influenced decision-making. The Ottoman command was responsible for maintaining control across a broad frontier. Prolonged concentration at a single site limited flexibility elsewhere and increased exposure to seasonal risks. The continued investment of resources at Eger had to be weighed against the need to preserve forces for other obligations and future operations. The absence of rapid progress altered the cost-benefit balance of continued siege. While the fortress remained damaged and under pressure, it had not been reduced within the expected time frame. Each additional phase required renewed expenditure of time, supplies, and manpower with diminishing returns. By mid to late October 1552, these interacting constraints had converged. The siege could be continued only at increasing cost and decreasing effectiveness. Withdrawal did not indicate abandonment of broader objectives, but reflected recognition that conditions no longer favored successful reduction of the fortress during that campaign season. The decision to lift the siege followed established strategic logic. Campaigns were adjusted when operational conditions shifted beyond acceptable limits. Preserving forces and resources for future operations was preferable to continued commitment under deteriorating circumstances. The failure of the siege, therefore, resulted from converging structural limitations rather than from any single decisive factor. Time, logistics, environmental conditions, defensive adaptation, and the limits of siege technology interacted to prevent a successful conclusion. Following the decision to lift the siege in October 1552, Ottoman forces began an organized withdrawal from the vicinity of Eger. This withdrawal did not take the form of a retreat under pressure. It was conducted according to established procedures, with units disengaging in sequence and maintaining cohesion as they moved away from the fortress. Artillery, equipment, and supplies were recovered where possible, and remaining siege works were abandoned once their function ceased. The immediate effect of the withdrawal was the restoration of access between the fortress and the surrounding region. Isolation ended as movement along nearby routes resumed. Communications that had been interrupted during the siege were re-established, allowing information, supplies, and personnel to move again. The fortress, while damaged, remained operational within the limits imposed by its condition at the end of the siege. Inside Eger, the conclusion of active operations shifted priorities from defense to stabilization. Damaged sections of the walls required assessment and temporary repair to prevent further deterioration. Internal defenses constructed during the siege remained in place, as removing them would have reduced protection in the event of renewed operations. Resources were directed toward restoring basic functionality rather than comprehensive reconstruction. Losses sustained during the siege affected the garrison's immediate capacity. Wounded personnel required care, and available manpower was reduced. Supplies that had been consumed during isolation needed replenishment. These tasks proceeded gradually, shaped by the availability of external support and the broader demands placed on regional authorities. From a strategic perspective, the outcome of the siege imposed limits rather than producing a decisive transformation. The failure to take Eger delayed further operations in northern Hungary, but it did not reverse territorial changes achieved earlier in the campaign or in preceding years. Ottoman control over central regions remained intact, and the broader frontier configuration established by the mid-16th century persisted. For Royal Hungary, the survival of the fortress provided temporary stabilization along a section of the northern defensive line. Eger continued to function as a forward position, influencing movement and communication across nearby routes. Its continued occupation reduced immediate pressure on adjacent territories and limited the need to divert resources to compensate for its loss. At the same time, the condition of the fortress highlighted the fragility of frontier defense. Damage sustained during the siege underscored the difficulty of maintaining fortifications under repeated pressure. Repair and reinforcement required time and funding that were not consistently available. The ability to restore full defensive strength remained constrained by structural and financial limitations. The broader strategic environment following the siege remained unchanged in key respects. The tripartite division of Hungary continued to shape political and military planning. Frontier warfare persisted through raids, limited engagements, and intermittent sieges rather than through decisive resolution. Neither side achieved comprehensive dominance along the boundary. The outcome at Eger demonstrated the capacity of a fortress to delay operations under certain conditions, but it did not establish a permanent barrier. Ottoman forces retained the ability to return in subsequent campaigns, and the fortress itself would remain exposed to future operations. The balance between offense and defense along the frontier continued to depend on resources, timing, and coordination rather than on single engagements. In the months following the siege, attention shifted to seasonal considerations. Armies reduced their operational tempo as winter approached, and planning for future campaigns replaced active engagement. Decisions made during this period reflected assessment of both recent experience and ongoing constraints. The Siege of Eger, therefore, concluded with limited but tangible effects. It interrupted the momentum of the 1552 campaign in northern Hungary and preserved a key defensive position for the time being. At the same time, it did not alter the underlying strategic realities governing the region. Control remained divided, resources remained strained, and future confrontations remained likely. In the decades following 1552, the Siege of Eger entered a different phase of existence, one shaped not by military operations, but by memory, record-keeping, and later interpretation. The immediate documentary record of the siege consisted of administrative reports, correspondence, and chronicles produced within the conventions of 16th-century writing. These sources preserved information about events, damage, and outcomes, but they did not yet transform the siege into a symbolic narrative. During the later 16th and 17th centuries, references to the Siege of Eger appeared intermittently in historical accounts concerned primarily with frontier warfare and territorial administration. In these contexts, the siege was treated as one among many engagements along a contested boundary. It was cited for its operational consequences and its place within broader military developments rather than for any exceptional narrative quality. As time passed, the political landscape of the region continued to change. The fortress itself eventually fell to Ottoman forces in 1596, and control over Hungarian territories shifted repeatedly in subsequent decades. These later events altered how earlier engagements were remembered, as attention moved between episodes according to contemporary relevance. The Siege of 1552 remained part of the historical record, but did not yet occupy a central place in collective memory. A significant transformation occurred much later, particularly during the 18th and 19th centuries, when interest in national history increased across Central Europe. During this period, earlier events were re-examined and reinterpreted within new intellectual and cultural frameworks. The Siege of Eger was among the episodes that received renewed attention. This process involved selective emphasis. Certain aspects of the siege, such as prolonged resistance against a numerically superior force, were highlighted, while other elements, including broader strategic context and later developments, received less attention. Narrative focus shifted from administrative and military mechanisms towards simplified accounts that emphasized endurance and defense. Literary treatments played a central role in this shift. Works produced in the 19th century presented the siege in forms intended for a broad readership, adapting historical material to narrative conventions of the period. These adaptations introduced elements not fully supported by 16th-century documentation or expanded minor details into central features of the story. Over time, these representations influenced popular understanding more strongly than earlier records. This process did not involve fabrication in the sense of inventing an event that did not occur. Rather, it involved reframing. Documented actions were reorganized, dramatized, or assigned greater significance than they held within their original context. The siege became a focal point through which later generations explored themes of continuity, loss, and territorial defense. From a historical standpoint, distinguishing between event and memory requires attention to source type and period. Contemporary records provide information about troop movements, damage to fortifications, and administrative responses. Later narratives reflect the priorities and perspectives of the periods in which they were produced. Each serves a different function and must be evaluated accordingly. The persistence of the Siege of Eger in historical memory reflects its suitability for narrative condensation rather than its singularity within 16th-century warfare. Many frontier fortresses experienced prolonged sieges, temporary survival, and later capture. Eger's experience in 1552 aligned with these patterns, even as later interpretation elevated its prominence. Academic historiography in the modern period has addressed this distinction by situating the siege within its structural context. Studies emphasize logistical constraints, fortification design, and campaign sequencing rather than symbolic meaning. This approach restores the siege to its place within the operational history of the Ottoman, Habsburg frontier. When examined through this lens, the historical significance of the siege lies in its demonstration of how fortified positions could delay operations under specific conditions. It illustrates the interaction between artillery, defensive adaptation, seasonal limits, and administrative capacity. These factors explain the outcome more fully than later narrative emphasis. The endurance of the siege in cultural memory does not negate its historical reality, but it alters perception. Recognizing this difference allows the event to be understood both as a documented military episode of 1552 and as a later construct shaped by changing interpretive needs. Between the 16th and 19th centuries, the Siege of Eger thus moved from recorded event to remembered episode, acquiring layers of meaning that extended beyond its original circumstances. Separating these layers restores clarity to the historical record. In its documented form, the siege remains one operation among many along a contested frontier. In its remembered form, it became a point of reference shaped by later historical consciousness. Understanding both dimensions completes the account of the siege without conflating memory with event.